Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Paula. Thank you very much. And just to introduce myself, my name is Clem Hutton-Mills. I am a non-executive lay canon of the Cathedral, basically a trustee. And I'm also a managing director of a little bank around the corner called Goldman Sachs. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel for tonight. Professor Melissa Butcher is Program Director at Cumberland Lodge with over 2 decades experience leading major programs and international research projects in the UK, in Europe, and in Asia. Previously, Melissa has held academic posts at Birkbeck, University of London, the Open University, and Trinity College, Dublin. Next, we have Nadia Miners, Vice President, Head of Compliance at Vocalink, with over 15 years of experience in the professional and financial services sectors. She sits on the London Advisory Board at York St John University and the Women in Business Advisory Board for the London Chamber of Commerce and Industry. On my right, we have Katerina Karamani, and she spent a total of 9 years working in the corporate sector within the City of London, primarily across audit and corporate finance functions, having initially begun her career as a degree apprentice at 18 years of age. And finally, Yunus Alam. He is an economics graduate from King's College London and has spent 2 years navigating complex market dynamics in commodities trading at Macquarie. So that's the panel. I'll now hand over to Melissa to present the key findings from the research. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Melissa Butcher.
Thanks so much, Clem, and thank you all for coming along this evening for what we hope is the start of an ongoing conversation about our workplace and how it's changing. It's just been really interesting to see some of your reflections coming up on the screen, some of the words that we heard coming through in the report as well, the kind of tensions that Gen Z have to deal with, the idea of being stressed, precarious, but also being innovative and curious. These are the kind of dynamics that we're seeing being played out in the workplace and that managers are having to work with as well. So, for those not familiar with Cumberland Lodge, though, a tiny bit of history. Cumberland Lodge is bookended by 2 major conflicts. The lodge was built in the 1650s in the aftermath of the English Civil War. It changed hands from parliamentarian to royalist and became a royal residence for 300 years. Then in the aftermath of the Second World War, the lodge was gifted by the royal family to become an educational charity to work with young people to try to understand the causes and impacts of social division and conflict in order to try and not have it happen again, to try and create more just and inclusive futures. At present, we do this through several streams of work. Our Youth and Democracy Project, which is working with young people around the country to re-engage them with the practices and institutions of democracy. We're working with police, legal practitioners and students from the UK and the Commonwealth on our Rule of Law project, trying to understand the threats and opportunities to the rule of law. We're hoping to start again our Freedom of Religion and Belief project next year, where we'll be working with emerging faith and belief leaders to see how we can strengthen social cohesion in the UK. And we're working with hundreds, probably getting up to thousands now of young people that take part in our Exploring Ethics workshops each year, reflecting on what our values are, the values that drive our behaviours, but also reflecting on the question of why good people sometimes do the wrong thing. In all of these conversations that we're having with young people, what we hear again and again are questions centred around intergenerational justice or injustice, as the case may be. What future for them when faced with these existential questions of climate change and artificial intelligence, uncertain employment, housing precarity, geopolitical crises? Now, these questions in turn led us to this current partnership with St Paul's to explore how these values are changing across generations and how this is impacting on our workplace. Our aim is to explore and understand generational differences in today's workplace with a focus on bridging the gaps. We have a very practical approach, I think, at Cumberland Lodge. We want to try and develop resources that organisations can use to help bridge these differences, to overcome some of the misunderstandings that happen between generations as culture changes. So I'm just going to give you some of the headlines from the report. Hopefully everyone's been able to pick up a copy of the report when you came in, but there's also, if you haven't, you can pick one up on the way out. It'll also be available on our website online as well. For brevity, I'm going to refer to Gen Z as a collective noun, but we really want to emphasise the need to move away from stereotypes. Gen Z is not homogenous, but that there are events and social conditions that mark out the experience of every generational cohort, and this impacts on how we work together and on the sort of workplace practices that evolve. And this is what we're trying to really map out. So, first of all, the wider social, political, and economic context. When we think about Gen Z, some of these words came up in the word cloud as well. There's an idea that they're stressed or anxious or sometimes lazy. That's a word that we heard come up a lot, particularly in media stereotypes of Gen Z, that they're kind of the entitled or lazy generation. There's a reason why each generation has particular characteristics, and those reasons are embedded in the social, political, and economic conditions that they experience. So you could think about your own markers of your own generation. I think we've got a nice range from boomers down to Gen Z in the audience, so you might want to think about what experience did you have in your generation that has left their mark on that cohort? If you were a boomer, 1945 to 1965, if you were born in those years, a post-World War II world, the Cold War, more hierarchical social structures that are the legacy of industrialisation. In the UK, a politics that established public services such as the NHS. If you're Gen X, born 66 to 79-ish, you start to live through major social movements that are maybe questioning those social hierarchies, such as feminism. In the 1970s, we also see crises like the energy crisis, geopolitical impacts on this country, which impact on how we think about our relationships with other countries, questions of dependency, for example. Millennials, 1980 to 1995, shifts in the economy towards services, deindustrialization, and neoliberal globalization start to take off. And that brings us then to Gen Z, those born around 1996 to 2010s, and marked in particular by debates around climate change, economic precarity, and in particular rapid technological developments, the digital age. So the office then becomes more than just a place of work. It's also a container for this complex web of relationships, partnerships, collaborations, networking, and socializing that bring together these different generations that have experienced social, political, and economic events that have left their mark on each generation. The workplace, in effect, is a microcosm, or some might say the eye of a perfect storm, for all the forces of change that we're grappling with in our society at any given time. For Gen Z, their experience has been marked in particular by things such as the global financial crisis, for example, that saw ideas about our foundational economic structures become visibly shaky. It was not so much the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama argued, but the start of rethinking inequality and what sustains it. Gen Z have spent formative years living through policies of austerity and the rolling back of public services. The words precarity and flexibility are words they have grown up with in their everyday media landscape. They've been impacted by changes such as Brexit, the change in the UK's relationship with the rest of the world, new forms of mobility and migration. And so they're growing up with a different map of the world as well to the one that Gen X, my generation, and boomers grew up with. Young people today, Gen Zs and Alphas coming up behind them, in comparison to other generations, are increasingly dissatisfied or alienated from politics and existing systems of governance, with worrying numbers globally believing that democracy is not fit for purpose. So the result is that Gen Z may not be so much an entitled generation, if we go back to some of the stereotypes about Gen Z, but one that has grown up in an out-of-control world, and they're trying to regain a sense of control through controlling workloads, through controlling work-life balance, developing new ways of working, managing precarity perhaps by making sure there's always a side hustle. And these are some of the factors that we've seen cited in the research and in the report. So that brings us then to new ways of working that we're seeing Gen Z develop. One of the greatest drivers of change in the workplace that marks out Gen Z in particular has been technology. In the 2000s and 2010s, the technological innovations that allowed people to work flexibly intensified. As we all know, we all lived through COVID-19. The lockdowns highlighted that the traditional office isn't actually necessary. Access to smartphones, laptops, and other technology means work can be done flexibly and remotely outside the city, outside the country, not confined to 9 to 5. So managers today are required to develop new techniques for harnessing the combined power of their employees, of their workers, who are sitting in front of individual screens scattered across various locations. So Gen Z is the first generation to finish their education and join the workforce during this period of intense reorientation of work that's been described as the post-pandemic state of flux. Now, we could argue that technological change is something that affects all generations, but in particular, the speed of change is what causes a sense of a society that's fracturing for many people. I'm of the generation that just 40 years ago was punching holes in cards to make the computers add stuff up. Young people today are now entering the workforce who have known nothing but the hybrid or flexible working that technology and digital worlds enable. And innovations are coming at us at speed. So we have generations that have very different expectations of where and how we can work and what the limits of technology are, sitting next to each other trying to figure out how to get along. Now, the advantages and disadvantages of different ways of working are being weighed up. In the office, there's the opportunity for networking, for creativity, for mentoring, for socializing, but there are also disadvantages such as the cost of maintaining large offices, commuting costs for employees, etc. There's also costs to working from home, as we've seen in the report, such as losing that clear boundary between work and private life, which can have an impact on well-being. However, from a Gen Z perspective, what we find is that while socializing and in-person learning opportunities are important, their significance may be overstated by some employers as Gen Z adapt to technology and online living and are finding new ways to network and to learn. Gen Z are also embedding mobility and lifelong learning into their lives, learning through different life and work experiences, and which is being facilitated by digital technologies. While mobility may be again perceived by older generations as a lack of loyalty or lack of commitment, from a Gen Z perspective, mobility becomes a necessity when you're surveying a world that changes exponentially as technology changes. There's a need for continuous learning. We are also currently seeing companies adopt different ways to manage these tensions. Some companies, as I'm sure you're aware in this room, are calling all employees back to the office, which is meeting opposition. We also note in the report legal cases that are now emerging as well as we try to find this balance between where and when and how we work. And finding that balance is also something that we're seeing in this idea of work-life balance that is quite predominant in the research around Gen Z, something that they're searching for. So in tandem with this push for hybrid flexible working, we're rethinking what it means to have those cutoffs between our work and our private life. And perhaps this is one of the key areas where we see how personal values or ethical frameworks are coming to impact on how we work and who we work with. And this is also, I think, where the stereotypes around lazy or entitled Gen Z emerge most strongly. One anecdote, we have a research fellows program as well at Cumberland Lodge, and one of our former fellows who works for a financial services company, when I asked her if she had some Gen Z colleagues who might like to get involved in the project, she said no, they have a lot of trouble attracting and maintaining Gen Z employees, largely because of working conditions like long hours. And this is something that you'll see in the report coming through quite strongly. Again, the Gen Z workers coming into the workforce and trying to navigate the idea that you don't have to work these incredibly long hours that perhaps in the past was considered to be expected in the city in particular. So one of the values we hear often from Gen Z in the research is this desire to find and maintain a work-life balance, a desire to carve out time for socializing and leisure, but also a desire to have the occasional side hustle. Navigating traditional career paths while exploring other opportunities, this idea of the side hustle, contributes to the idea that Gen Z is entrepreneurial. But then we also start to see a dual pressure on Gen Z. On the one hand, expected to drive innovation, but to do it within frameworks that they may reject or that might hamper that innovation. So the push for work-life balance also ties in with a greater awareness of well-being and mental health in the workplace and a greater willingness to have those personal conversations that might have once been considered beyond the purview of workplace managers. This brings us to the idea of bringing your whole self to work, your authentic self to work. The values expressed in trying to find work-life balance are reflected in this idea of wanting to work for companies that also reflect those personal values, including having clear ethical frameworks. And this is another example of where wider social change comes into play and that managers are having to address. The generational experience for Gen Z has been marked by debates on equality, questions around racism and gender in particular, the emergence of Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movements, being more open to gender fluidity. Importantly, Gen Z appear more likely to speak out about value-related issues, including issues such as working hours, pushing back against these more hierarchical social structures that might have worked for the industrial age, but in a post-industrial age, in a digital age, where we're looking at more flat structures emerging in the workplace. This is, again, something that Gen Z are really driving, this idea that you can work differently and have a different management structure. However, the outspokenness can sometimes lead to tensions in the workplace. The idea of trying to support personal autonomy, to have a more collaborative workspace, as well as perhaps calling out behaviours that in the past that today are not considered appropriate. But this is also evidence for where the argument that Gen Z is not a homogenous cohort. For example, we are seeing values diverge along gender lines. There's some research now that's emerging, particularly in the US, that highlights that young women appear to hold more progressive or liberal views or values, while young men can be more likely to hold more conservative values. And there's quite a lot of research ongoing at the moment into this idea of the manosphere. So in terms of how reflection on questions of equality manifests itself in the workplace practices, there are fracture points, as I mentioned, where once what was considered acceptable language attitudes in the workplace are no longer acceptable. And this can cause concern for some who then feel that they are being censored or cancelled. And at this point, I'd also really like to pose a challenge to some of the popular writing about Gen Z and increasingly Generation Alpha as well. The idea of the anxious generation, if you're familiar with the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt's work, or the snowflake generation, anxiety about change runs across all generations. And yet if you were to read much of what's been written about Gen Z in the media, it would appear as if the problem is solely theirs. There's a real need to recognise that older generations are also anxious about change. What is familiar to us gives us comfort. So for managers whose professional sense of esteem may be linked to their performance at work, they are now having to manage a process of intergenerational cultural change in their workplace, and that means managing their own emotional and professional responses to that process of change, perhaps without quite understanding what is driving the change to begin with. So in other words, it's not all about Gen Z. If we're going to hold up the mirror, it could be argued that there are other generations being a bit snowflakey as well. There's a need for all generations to navigate shifting expectations and practices and to understand our own responses to these transformations in order to be effective. Which brings us to the last point about how we can use the office as a meeting point for different generations. So while generational conflict in the workplace is not new, the current historical context presents some unique challenges. Gen Z are beginning their careers amid precarity and inequality, alongside complex social, economic, and political issues such as climate change, as I mentioned, rapid technological shifts. Gen Z are going to inherit and work within these complex challenges that require equally complex solutions. So if we have misunderstandings between generations, that can divert attention and energy away from addressing some of these critical issues. But if we foster intergenerational collaborations, then perhaps we have a better chance of tackling some of them. And this is where the office or the workplace can become a fantastic space for generations to encounter each other in order to create a better understanding of different values and workplace practices. But this is a process that needs to be facilitated. We sometimes expect to just throw people together and that they will just be able to figure it out without taking into account power differences, differences in personality, and that people may need to agree a common vocabulary before they can start to figure things out. So some of the strategies that we highlight in the report include reverse mentoring, establishing shadow boards of young people, or the kind of work that we do at Cumberland Lodge, which is creating space for and facilitating dialogue across difference. For these strategies to be effective, they must be thoughtfully tailored to the specific context of each organisation and supported by ongoing evaluation and feedback. We would argue that these strategies enable the possibility for understanding the values which underpin and drive intergenerational differences in workplace practices, moving beyond the stereotypes of the entitled Gen Z or OK Boomer being the stereotype at the other end. To instead leverage these intergenerational differences for a more effective workplace by ultimately valuing and integrating the perspectives of all age groups. And in so doing, workplaces will be in a better position to navigate these complex challenges of the multi-generational office, as well as the shifting social, economic, and political context in which it's situated. So that's, in brief, a summary of the report, and I hope there's a lot more detail in the report and a lot more evidence that we've provided to support the arguments that we're making here. But we thought it would be much more interesting to hear from people actually working in the offices in the city to kind of hear from their experiences as well. So I'll hand over to Nadia.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for inviting me here today to share my reflections on this insightful and timely report. I'd like to extend a special thanks to Paula Gooder for connecting me to Cumberland Lodge following the meaningful conversation we had last year at the project's inception. I'd also like to express my gratitude to Lindsay Robinson for drafting such a thorough report with clear and actionable recommendations. This topic resonates deeply with me as I observe the evolving expectations across generations in the workplace, both as a mentor and as a functional leader of a team that includes Gen Z, who are just starting out on their professional journeys. Today, I'd like to highlight 3 takeaways from the report. 1, hybrid and flexible working. 2, work-life balance. And 3, managing inequalities. So firstly, hybrid and flexible working. The demand for hybrid working has intensified since the pandemic, accelerating trends that many financial services firms were already exploring as a means to drive efficiencies. For Gen Z, hybrid working offers the flexibility to pursue personal responsibilities with the same dedication as their professional duties, aligning with their desire for a sense of purpose in all aspects of their lives. 54% of Gen Z employees report that hybrid working has positively impacted their mental health, with this increasing amongst parents, ethnic minorities, and individuals with visible disabilities, possibly because this gives them psychological safety. Interestingly, many Gen Z have only ever known hybrid working, viewing remote work as a symbol of trust between employer and employee as a core value for them, as work is often deemed to extend beyond the traditional 9 to 5. In my experience, Gen Z prioritise career development and meaningful work over compensation, although the flexibility of hybrid work remains crucial for attention and engagement. However, not all leaders share this view. David Solomon, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, has referred to remote working as an aberration, reflecting how hybrid work adoption is often closely aligned with an organisation's culture. I've personally witnessed this dynamic with a recent interview hire who, despite wanting flexibility, also sought in-office opportunities to grow and build relationships, having felt isolated in an existing fully remote role. In my opinion, Gen Z employees working remotely may miss out on organic networking and collaborative learning opportunities, which can be a concern as relationships and soft power remain important to achieving success. Gen Z's openness to changing jobs, coupled with their reluctance to view job loyalty as a priority, suggests that we need to ensure our work environments continually evolve to meet their needs. Number 2, work-life balance. Historically, high social status has been associated with long working hours, but this is increasingly being rejected by Gen Z. They expect employers to honour commitments to work-life balance and evaluate these against the broader framework of environmental, social and governance, particularly in diversity, equity and inclusion. Social media has amplified Gen Z's ability to call out poor working conditions, increasing the accountability of employers. The very concept of work-life balance, however, varies widely, whether it's about avoiding conflict between work and home life or achieving equal satisfaction in both domains. The Sandra Brown Duckett, the CEO of TIAA, offers an interesting perspective. She suggests work-life balance is a myth and instead advocates for viewing life as a diversified portfolio. Her view is that whatever we spend time on, we should strive to excel. This resonates with me and underlines the idea that balance is more about a mindset rather than rigid compartmentalization. Many Gen Z employees link work-life balance directly to mental health, expecting their managers to support their well-being. This can create intergenerational tension, as not all managers feel it is their role to manage mental health. However, research shows that Gen Z who feel cared for at work are 3 times more likely to look forward to their job and less likely to leave. One potential solution to this conflict is fostering open dialogues about mental health, allowing Gen Z to share their experiences candidly and openly. Number 3, managing inequalities. Living and working in the City of London often comes with higher than average salaries. However, the rising cost of living, especially housing, contributes to growing inequalities, with Gen Z disproportionately affected. Many Gen Z professionals live in rented accommodation, often in boroughs neighbouring the city, unable to afford their own homes. The student debt crisis further compounds this financial insecurity, exacerbating some of the media stereotypes around anxiety and stress. Older generations sometimes dismiss these concerns, attributing the difficulties of home ownership to a lack of savings, often stereotyping both millennials and Gen Z as prioritising frivolous spending over saving, for example, buying avocados and coffees. I have also seen that social media has amplified a sense of impatience and comparison among younger generations, who often measure themselves against influencers who appear to have it all. My advice here is simple: run your own race, focus on your path, be strategic and deliberate in your choices, as each of us have a unique journey and legacy to build. As inequality becomes more prevalent for all, it's critical that we engage in open discussions and work together to drive change where possible. One of the recommendations in the report around reverse mentoring also resonated with me, as it's something I'm currently engaged in. It has been an invaluable opportunity for me to provide insights into some of the challenges I've faced, but also witness the challenges that some of the Gen Z generation face, while giving them the opportunity to learn about corporate culture. It also helps foster mutual understanding across generations and bridges the gaps between different perspectives. It's helped me embrace a growth mindset, recognising that we all have something to learn and teach. By approaching work with openness and curiosity, we can continually evolve our ways of working to suit the needs of all. In conclusion, the report emphasises that the workplace is evolving, shaped by generational shifts in work values and expectations. We must continue to adapt, ensuring we provide an environment that supports and nurtures talents across all generations. By doing so, we'll not only meet the needs of today's workforce, but also build a more resilient, inclusive and economically prosperous future for the City of London.
I just wanted to start by taking the opportunity also to thank everyone involved in this research project and the preparation of this report. I think we live and work in an era of remarkable workplace diversity, including race, culture, gender, disability, religion, sexual orientation, etc. Yet sometimes age and generational diversity seems to get overlooked, despite the fact we have more of it now than ever before. So I think this is a really important topic, and I look forward to continuing the conversation on it. It seems very clear to me that generational diversity is... Sorry, that change in volume has thrown me slightly. It seems clear to me that many see generational diversity as a challenge and perhaps even a liability. Personally, I see it as a huge opportunity. I think that organisations that are able to recognise and leverage the strength that each generation brings stands to benefit from a huge competitive advantage. And I actually think that achieving that is simpler than many of us may think, because whilst the report correctly highlights many differences between Gen Z and the other generations, as Melissa has helpfully just run us through, I actually believe that what unites us all is far greater than what divides us. When we think objectively about core job attitudes and values, I actually don't think these are vastly different across all generations. We all want to feel valued, empowered and engaged. We want to be helpful, have impact, learn and improve our skills. We all tend to value job security and want to see a path towards professional development. We all want to have meaning. I think the difference is that how we define, for example, what makes work meaningful may differ from one generation to the next. And I also think that Gen Z have different perspectives on careers and what defines success. in the workplace and in life more broadly, and I think that really affects how we show up at work and in life in general. But I think if we start to view generations as a lens through which to understand societal change, rather than a label with which to oversimplify groups, I think that will really help us understand one another with an awful lot more clarity. And I really feel that achieving that starts with empathy. To really appreciate Gen Z in the workplace, I think we first need to put ourselves in their shoes. If you imagine for a moment, if you sort of take a step back and travel back in time to your first day at your first adult job, do you remember how that felt? What you wore, what your manager and colleagues were like, how that first introduction you had impacted your perceptions of what the future at that workplace might be. Now imagine the year is 2020, you've just graduated in a global pandemic. You had no graduation or celebration of all of your hard work. You've likely started your adult job from your childhood bedroom. All your interactions are remote. You're unable to meet any of your colleagues in person. You're likely living with your parents again. And even if that's something that, even that's an active choice you made and you want to do that, there's likely no way you can afford to move out on your own. If you were entering the workplace under these circumstances, wouldn't your perceptions be slightly different? Would you also feel a little bit apprehensive? We have to remember that Gen Z is entering the workforce at a time of unprecedented change. They're dealing with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the skyrocketing cost of living, the price of higher education, advances in technology, social media. Each of these things has had a huge impact on their mental health and just on their introduction to the working world. But this generation, like millennials 15 years ago, faces a lot of criticism. Criticism for being difficult, for lacking in motivation, being lazy, entitled. None of that was true for millennials, and none of it's true for Gen Z either. This generation wants to work and contribute. We want to find purpose in life. We want to strive towards achieving our goals. The problem is, we're grappling with the reality that the big motivators of work, such as promise of financial independence or a comfortable retirement, seem increasingly out of reach. So this generation's skepticism is not a sign of laziness, but actually a reflection of the present-day complexities and sometimes chaos of society. Regardless, Gen Z doesn't want, nor do they expect, more than any other generation. We simply want to work in an environment with people who care about us, respect our time and boundaries, and provide security and stability. And I think there's lots we can do to bridge the intergenerational gap. So many things, and I want to list a few of them if that's okay. So I think the first is leaders and human resources environments and organisations, I think, need to firstly recognise that huge stereotypes exist and be proactive in identifying what they are and understanding how they're impacting culture in the team. You know, we've all heard of the tech-adverse boomers, the super independent Gen X who focus more on individual success rather than team success, and lazy Generation Z that don't care about working hard, and we know that none of that's true. So being proactive about challenging those stereotypes, I think, is the first step and super important. I just think we also need to stop generalising and start individualising. One size absolutely does not fit all. Age doesn't determine who we are. We're all different. We have unique preferences, motivators, needs, and skills. And I think new hire onboarding teams ought to build into their training programs all about teaching Gen Z and new recruits how to bring their whole authentic self to work rather than encouraging individuals to fit into an existing workplace environment. I also think that intergenerational knowledge sharing is super important, and one of those could be mentoring programs that pair younger individuals with more experienced individuals. And I've personally really benefited from such a program, and it's the reason I'm here today. I was paired with David Matthews, who's actually a trustee of Cumberland Lodge when I first joined KPMG at 18 years old, and we've had such incredible conversations and meetings, and it's really been super formative to my whole career.
I also think we need to embrace different communication styles. It may or may not be the case that certain boomers prefer face-to-face meetings or phone calls. It might be that millennials prefer to exchange emails, or that Gen Z prefer instant messaging or perhaps even social media. But I think we need to really embrace all of these different communication styles to relate to the various individuals in our teams. And we need to be curious rather than judgmental. We should just ask what matters to people and what their preferences are, and stop making assumptions about what works best for people. It just will save us making those mistakes. And lastly, I think we all need to lead by example in ensuring that every voice is heard, regardless of age or seniority. Every voice matters, and everybody has value to add. And as soon as we're able to start building, taking all of that into account, the more productive our teams will be. Thank you all very much.
Hello everyone, my name is Yunus. Firstly, thank you to everyone at Cumberland Lodge and St. Paul's for inviting me over here, and thank you to everyone for attending. This is really a big honour to speak in front of such a large crowd. Discussions like this are essential as they foster open dialogue and encourage the contributions of all generations. While sharing experiences among peers within the same generational cohort is valuable, it is equally important to ensure that these perspectives are recognised and included in broader, impactful conversations. It's through these conversations that our views can truly be seen, heard, and integrated into meaningful change in a workplace. I started my career while still at university. I was working while studying, and once I finished university, I continued and became fully immersed. I've worked for 2 years now, and during that time, I've seen a lot. When I first started, the world had already become unrecognizable to a few years ago. COVID had just happened, and the world was still dealing with the fallout of that. Within my few months, I had already witnessed the chaos and craziness that followed Liz Truss, the Russia-Ukraine war, global supply shortages, and a new interest rate environment. I think it's safe to say there was a lot going on. I've seen and experienced a lot since then. I've shared and created experiences with people from all walks of life, from all backgrounds and all ages. Being a part of Gen Z and working in a city, the best part is being able to follow the wisdom and footsteps of those who were here before. All of their knowledge and experiences are passed down, and they take it upon themselves to nurture and foster young talent. I have been very lucky to have had many mentors who have provided me with nothing but support and advice, and have been shaping and will continue to shape my career. A large majority of my experiences have been nothing but positive, but there are a few things that can be a little bit difficult. A big thing that I've had to overcome is quite literally being treated like a baby. I am 21 years old. Many of my colleagues and seniors have children or grandchildren who are also 21 years old. That can lead to difficulties connecting and difficulties relating with people. As members of a generation that has grown up in an era where technology has become an extension to how we think and work, we often bring different perspectives to problem solving, perspectives shaped by our familiarity with digital tools and a culture of efficiency. However, despite these strengths, there can be a tendency and a bias to view younger professionals through the lens of inexperience, leading to situations where our contributions are undervalued. This reflects a broader generational divide in the workplace, where traditional hierarchies and new ways of working may sometimes clash with Gen Z's emphasis on adaptability and efficiency. The result is having to balance a complex dynamic, balancing the need to respect established practices and expertise whilst advocating for newer approaches that reflect the rapidly evolving professional landscape. Another big thing to overcome is different priorities with regards to work and life. I've seen that people senior to me in age tend to associate their lives with work and work with their lives. Myself and many other people around my age would most likely not say the same. Gen Z first embarking on their professional careers amidst so much uncertainty has surely shaped our mindsets. It was difficult to ascertain and navigate what exactly the workplace would be like at a time when the workplace was continuously and incrementally having to adjust. Pandemics and unprecedented technological change, it's fair to say that we have been structured to evolve like no other generation before. I would say there has been a profound shift in the skills we find ourselves prioritizing. Unlike previous generations who often spent their entire careers within a single company, Gen Z is far less tied to traditional notions of job loyalty. This does not stem from a lack of commitment, but from more of an entrepreneurial mindset. We prioritise personal growth, skill development and new experiences. This shift from loyalty to adaptability is a defining characteristic of how Gen Z navigates the workplace. We can bridge generational gaps by creating a unique blend of approaches. We overcome these challenges by combining our creativity and an entrepreneurial mindset with the foresight, mentorship and industry expertise of those who came before us. We are able to create a workplace where fresh perspectives meet established wisdom, but this can only occur through open discourse and a sharing of a mutual feeling of respect. An acknowledgement that we will not approach work in the same manner and that we have very different experiences. However, the solution is not simply about tolerance, it's about actively structuring opportunities for cross-generational collaboration. Thank you all.
I think everyone here mentioned the words mindset. And I just want to explore that a little bit, because there was talk about different views of what success looks like, personal growth. Maybe Eunice, can you explore that a little bit more for us? What does success look like for you and for your generation?
I would say, for me, success is being happy with where I am. It's not necessarily tied to promotions in a job or, financial success, but more so, am I happy with what I've done and am I happy with where I'm going?
Okay, Katerina, have you got a similar worldview?
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, success is, working in a career, be that an organisation or a sort of personal pursuit that aligns with your personal values. I think there's lots of people that perhaps aren't even, haven't really thought actually about what their values are. But when you actually think about those, and you're in a work, you're working for individuals or with individuals that understand your values and you're able to kind of live them every day at work, I think that sort of defines success, as does having time alongside your career to pursue personal ambitions and goals.
Thank you. I think one of the differences, speaking as a banker and as a millennial, I think I often thought about working hard equating to having sort of economic success and therefore being able to buy a home and. Maybe Nadia, you can help me work our way through this. Do you think that one of the factors that affect Gen Z's attitude to work is that the idea that even if you work hard, you may not be able to afford a house in the near future? That seems to have broken down. How important is that?
Yes, I agree. I think that the Gen Z kind of cohort want to do meaningful work, they want to contribute, but I think their view is, as you mentioned, that regardless of how hard they work, some of their aspirations are still going to be unattainable, so they struggle to reconcile the two, and that's perhaps why they want to focus more on their personal lives so that they're actually able to see a tangible benefit rather than at work perhaps not being able to see that for many, many years.
Okay. Melissa, is that borne out by the research and
Yeah, very much so. And also those bigger existential questions about the future, with climate change in particular, that comes up a lot in discussions around intergenerational justice. So what is the point of earning a whole lot of money if there's not a planet or a viable life for the next generation that's coming through? So that's, I think, something that a lot of the young people involved in the research are reflecting on as well.
So I guess maybe my follow-on question, then I'll go to others, is if the value of work is no longer in terms of your compensation, but it's other things, what makes you feel most valued in the workplace? And Katerina, I'll start with you on that.
I think what makes me personally feel valued in the workplace is being recognised for the effort that I'm making and the value that I'm adding. And just on that note, that topic of kind of financial compensation, I agree that whilst salary is important, it's absolute, we as a generation do value it less than every other generation. And I think to win the hearts of Gen Z, organisations need to highlight their efforts towards, being genuinely good global citizens. And on that, actions very much speak louder than words. I think companies have got to demonstrate their commitment to a broader set of societal challenges, from sustainability through to climate change and hunger, etc., etc.
And Eunice, what makes you feel valued in the workplace?
I'd have to agree. I would say being recognized and being appreciated for the work you do, and the work you do having an impact on something, something that you can see, is very important.
Okay. So let's talk about money a little bit. And there is a sense that the London living wage, it's hard to fund a home life, a family life as things stand. I mean, is there an element of impatience that one just has to wait and do one's time before getting to that level of financial success? Maybe Nadia, you want to take that one on?
Yeah, I think perhaps older generations might have that view and say that they also had to work really hard to, obtain properties and to obtain financial security. But the report showed that I think during the boomers' time, I think their salaries had to be something like times four more, whereas now it's times 8 for Gen Z. So there is a big differential between what what Gen Z have to earn in order to be able to kind of match perhaps what their parents were able to achieve at a similar age. So I think my view is really that it's a combination of both. You have to continue to save, but you've also got to live your life. And I think hard work in the end does pay off. But perhaps when you are younger, it's hard to see that when you're working particularly hard and all of your money seems to go on, rent, and you can't necessarily see anything tangible from what you're working to achieve. But I think my view is you've really got to do both. You've got to live your life and you've got to save along the way, and hard work pays off.
Maybe just to add to that, Clem, I noticed impatience did come up in the word cloud, actually, and that does come through in the research as well, that sort of the older generations feel that Gen Z need to do their time, as it were. And you can see that not just in salary, but in things like sabbaticals, that you're getting younger employees asking for sabbaticals much earlier in their career than older generations may have done. But again, you could think about those contexts that we were talking about, the need to continuously learn and learn faster now because of the way that our digital worlds are changing. There is a need to always be upskilling and thinking about upskilling ourselves. So it's something that employers need to think about. It's like, how do you need to have another form of releasing employees to enable them to develop their skills in order to be more innovative in the future?
In some of the training that I've done as a manager in the firm, there's been a discussion around maybe when you're having a conversation with younger colleagues, don't insist on having a face-to-face. Have it done by email, have it done by, people might prefer to engage by text or email rather than in confrontational discussions. I just wanted to think about communication and office life. I mean, people might argue that surely it is better for career development to be with others in the office. And isn't working from home quite a sort of seductive practice that may limit career growth? Maybe Eunice, you want to start with that?
I myself actually prefer working in the office, if I'm being honest. Purely for the reasons that you said. I like to be amongst everybody there. I like to, if I need to speak to someone about something, I prefer doing it face to face. And it's always, especially when you're very young, very junior, networking is so powerful, and being in the office or being in the workplace, you can network much easier than you can if it was over, Zoom or Teams or whatever. And for myself, having a great network that I've built by being inside the office, I've had many opportunities come my way, and I've had a lot of people support me and put my name forward for many things. And I'm not too keen on working from home, let's just say.
Katrina, where do you sit on that spectrum of working from home? And
I totally agree with Eunice in that clearly there's so much value in being at the office. I personally prefer to work from the office as well. But I think, that's just my personal view. I think for Gen Z as a whole, in-person interactions are very important. Just because we're digital natives, that doesn't mean, we kind of hate or kind of want to avoid face-to-face interactions. Quite the opposite. We want to collaborate face-to-face.
But that's why I think the hybrid model is perfect. I think it provides individuals with the freedom and autonomy to kind of make that choice while allowing them to meet face-to-face or online. I think it's that flexibility that people really value, because whilst Eunice and I like to work from the office, there are other, and because that suits our lifestyles, there are, lifestyles of other people that, might lend themselves to spending more time in the mornings or in the evenings at home. So I think it's the choice that people value, because it also implies trust. I think when you're I think Gen Z understand that building trust takes time, but they kind of really appreciate being trusted to work from wherever suits them at a time that suits them.
Melissa, what comes out of the research on the sort of office, hybrid, totally at home spectrum?
Actually, you're also starting to see older generations demand more time at home as well. So it's not just Gen Z. I think this has come out of the pandemic, and we're still kind of disentangling the impacts of the pandemic. But again, it's this idea of familiarity. I think you've got a generation where it's just, this is the norm, that you wouldn't be 5 days a week in the office. And yet we do have companies, forgive me, I've forgotten, is it Google that just announced they wanted everyone in the office 5 days a week? Yeah, so Google have recently said 5 days a week, everybody in the office, which is interesting. You'd think for a digital company they would be more flexible, but for them the idea of creativity is important. So the research across the board is just highlighting that it's about finding the balance, and it's about people finding the balance of what works for them. There's gender differences here as well for women working from home, again, because we tend to deal still, guys, more of the housework and more of the childcare. This is an important issue. Bringing in you mentioned lifestyle, Katerina, so this weighing up, incorporating, I guess, lifestyle and work. So if you're working from home, you can pop out for a run or a cycle or do some volunteering work and then come back to home to the desk to work. So it's really just finding that balance, and for companies to try and find a way of building the trust that enables them to allow their organizations to do this. That is something that's a bit problematic. We're sort of seeing some companies look at different ways of surveilling staff at home as well, which is an interesting approach to kind of keeping track of what we're doing and what we're looking at on our computers and this kind of thing. I think Katerina's about to jump in there with some...
Oh, no, I'm just really surprised by that. I have never heard, I didn't realise that companies were doing that.
If there's some sort of there's a thing that looks like your mouse moving that you can use so people think that you're still working.
Oh right, yeah. There is that, yeah. The mouse wiggle.
Yeah. Nadia, do you have a thought on that sort of office, hybrid, home?
Yeah. So my view is, I think the option for both is important. I do think there's value in being in the office and having learning by osmosis and being able to take up those spontaneous or serendipitous opportunities that come up, which you only often get when you're in the office and you can't necessarily plan for. I don't like the idea of presenteeism, people just being in the office for the sake of being there, because I don't think that's useful for anybody. So something we do in our office is, in my particular team, we have particular days that we come in and we do collaborative work together. So that day there will be less meetings, but we will work together as a team on things that we need to deliver collectively. And that really works well, because everyone's coming in with the intention of focused engagement on a particular area. So I think that both are important, but I do think that the younger generation prefer to come in more, because it's important for them to build those networking opportunities and to just learn by assimilation, by being around and hearing those conversations that you don't necessarily get to hear when you're working from home.
It's a very interesting question from the floor around, is this discussion just a Western luxury? In the sense that you don't tend to have this conversation in India or China or Africa perhaps, and is this sort of based on privilege? Maybe Melissa, you could talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, most of the research you'll see in the report comes from Western sources, and there's some of the bigger companies, the services companies like Deloitte, for example, are constantly tracking generational change and focusing a lot on Gen Z. Yes, that's a really good question, and yes, I think most of the focus is on companies here in the West. Having said that, though, these are transnational companies. Some of that are leading in some of these debates and rethinking how the workplace is evolving, and they are relocating some of these practices to their offices in other countries, including India, where we also do some work there, or have done in the past with transnational corporations. So you do see these ideas traveling as well. So again, of course, there's still reams of our planet which is unequal. So that's something that we also need to think about. But again, it comes back to values, and these are again the values that Gen Z tend to be reflecting on and wanting to work for companies that are more aware of their position within global economic structures.
Maybe a question to you, Katerina. How do you think Gen Z's approach to values and belief systems differs from previous generations, millennials, boomers, and so on?
I think it's that we really value. It just comes back to that sort of work-life balance point. We really value our careers and our professional development, but there's so much more than just our careers that's important to us. I think in the past, perhaps, again, it's a generalisation, but people were perhaps much more just solely focused on their careers, and their success was perhaps defined by their career. But I think in this, for Gen Z, that's certainly not the case, and I think as a result, our values are very different. There's so much more to what success means. I think for most people, success is sort of happiness, but your actual core happiness, I don't think just stems from your career. It comes from living a kind of a meaningful life, and that there's so much I can explain about that, because for example, if you think back to those in the war, what they were doing was certainly had an awful lot of meaning, but they weren't necessarily happy. Whereas so I just think there's basically lots to think about. It's not necessarily just one of meaning or happiness or success or any of these things. It's about living a kind of a balanced life where they feel they're working on projects that are adding a lot of value, and that they're also able to pursue the things that mean a lot to them outside of work. I think this is the kind of key differentiator.
Melissa, I think you said in your introductory remarks that young women had a tendency towards more liberal attitudes and young men towards more conservative attitudes. Do you mind expanding on that, just so that we...
Yes, and this will have impacts on our politics as well, as you can see in the US, if you're following the US election there at the moment. Again, it's new research that's just coming through, new trends that we're starting to see in some of the surveys and the polling that's being done, primarily on politics, but it's just something to watch in how that's going to play out, particularly given that questions around gender fluidity, LGBTQI plus rights have become more mainstream issues for Gen Z. How those debates are going to play out in the workplace, and so it's something I would just flag for managers to think about. While we think that there's been sort of steps forward in terms of women's access to the workplace, if we're starting to see some of these a sort of a resurgence in certain attitudes towards women, and it's quite overt in some political circles about a more traditional view of women's place in society. Women should be at home, women should be looking after the families. These are becoming quite open public topics for debate in some circles. Not so much in this country at the moment, certainly in other countries like the US, but we are seeing them travel through this idea of the manosphere, through podcasters, the Andrew Tates of the world, etc. So again, it's just something that we're starting to see, and I think something that people should be aware of, especially if you're in a position of management.
Okay. Nadia, Eunice, I wanted to ask you a question. It's about management, it's about that mentor-mentee relationship and how that might begin to evolve, especially in a world where maybe one isn't expecting to stay in the same job forever. So what can be done to improve managers' ability to actually really care about who they are managing, who they are mentoring, when they're themselves operating under extreme pressures?
Okay. So for me, I think it's a lot about empathy and understanding. So when you, as a manager, when you decide to take on a mentoring type relationship, it's one where you are imparting your wisdom and knowledge to somebody else. But as I kind of mentioned when I was talking about my experience, I find there's always opportunity to learn as well from everybody. And for me, the mentee relationship is one where you've really just got to be open to understanding what the new generation are looking for. And there will be opportunities where perhaps what they say you can influence change or you can help them. But there are instances as well where they've got to be open to assimilation to cultures that already exist or structures that already exist. So there's a bit of compromise on both sides, is my view, and that's kind of the way I work. And it doesn't always work for everybody, but these are we're dismantling systems that have been around for a long time, and this is never something that can happen easily or quickly. So there's a level of patience we have to have, but also empathy and understanding along the way, and being open to learn from each other.
Thank you. And Eunice, what looks good in the context of a good manager, a good mentor?
I think the main thing is yourself and your mentor or your manager having a actually personal relationship, going beyond just the professional, staying within that rigid structure. I mean, it doesn't really give a reason to care, or it doesn't really give a reason to put any more effort into it from both sides. I think, just simple things is talking about sports or going out after work for drinks, or the easy little things like that can help build a personal relationship between yourself and your manager or a mentor. And then that personal relationship becomes more important, and then the manager or the mentor will take more pride in helping you out. Their success is your success, or the other way around, I mean. Yeah.
Catherine, you have a thought?
Yeah, I think further to what Nadia and Eunice have mentioned, I think what will help managers or mentors sort of care more about their relationship whilst balancing it alongside their other workload is seeing the value in it, I guess. I think, first and foremost, they should recognise that the individual that they're mentoring is part of the future generation. This generation of individuals are going to be increasingly joining the workforce. These are our future leaders, and I think it stands to reason that they should care about imparting their wisdom and knowledge, because that's only going to benefit everybody that they work with, clients, colleagues, etc., etc. And I agree with what Eunice said about what good looks like. I think making an effort to carve out the time. We all have we're all capable of carving out the time to spend on things that really matter to us. And I think when you enter that kind of relationship, it's a choice. And I think people that take it on, should be committed to spending that time. And it's a two-way thing, as everybody's mentioned. Both share knowledge and help each other develop. So I think it's really important.
Thank you. Very Pontius Pilate question. What is truth? Maybe we'll start with Professor Melissa first.
Yeah.
Where are you getting your news from? What is truth? What's that perception?
Well, again, and this, if we're looking at Gen Alpha as well, you may be already aware of this, but social media is becoming one of the key sources of news and information for younger generations, Gen Z and Alpha. And we've had at Cumberland Lodge workshops on mis and disinformation and malinformation as well. just because everyone seems to be struggling with how to determine what is truth. Like, how do you find out what is truth? We almost have too much information in the world today, and we're all struggling to kind of find out what is accurate, what is factual. But the key thing is just where people are getting this. And again, this word trust comes up a lot. And I think this is something that we really need to work on collectively as a society. I would say it's one of our key challenges. We're losing trust in our sources of news. We're losing trust in our own ability to tell what is truth. We're losing trust in our politicians, and we're losing trust in some of our civil institutions as well. So this is not great for a civil society, which is why across the generations, I think there's a need to kind of work together to try and address some of these challenges. But to the question, it's difficult. Social media is both a blessing and a curse in many ways, and I think that's something that we're still all grappling with. But maybe the younger members of the panel would be better to talk about how they use the social media.
Eunice, where are you getting your news from?
Well, it's a mix of everything, really. There is a lot of like traditional media, like newspapers or whatever, and as Melissa said, a large part of it will come from social media. I think the good thing is when you're reading something, say on a newspaper, it's gone through the hands of multiple journalists, multiple editors, and then a publisher. So you can't really know whether what you're reading or what you're seeing is genuinely what's happening. But the benefit of social media to some extent is you can see like what's actually happening. Whoever's there, whoever's on the ground can film or can commentate live, and you can get a better feeling for what's actually happening.
The question was, which particular bits of social media are you using?
Yeah, I don't think I'm the best qualified to answer this because I don't actually use social media.
Okay. Catherine, have you got a sense?
Similarly to Eunice, I'm not the most prolific on social media. I don't have Twitter or anything like that. I do have some of the other ones. I just think the only thing that I would add to what Eunice mentioned, I mean, I would guess it's Twitter is the main source. As I say, I'm not on Twitter, but I hear from friends that that's kind of the main domain that from which they extract their news. Lots of the news that I hear is actually like word of mouth, and it's what people are discussing. And I think back to the trust point that's been mentioned, I think inherently, like when I'm hearing things from my friends or family or people that I'm close to, there's just like a sort of a sense of trust, if these, I kind of feel like they perhaps have gone above and beyond to potentially verify what they've read. So I actually, don't really do that. I'm not massive on social media, but yeah, I think it was Twitter, etc.
Okay. We've got time for a couple of other questions. I'm going to ask one process question and then one broader question that I hope everyone can answer. And the process question is, did the research include the perspectives of both neurodivergent individuals as well as neurotypical Gen Z?
That's a really good question. The research, the interviews that we did were mostly with professionals in the city, and as far as I'm aware, it was neurotypical. The other research, if you look at the report, you'll see it's collating a lot of research that's being done by other sources, particularly large quantitative surveys. So I'm not aware of the level of neurodivergence or neurotypical respondents in those surveys. But that's a really excellent question in terms of thinking about, again, the idea that Gen Z is not homogenous. You could also think about differences in terms of ethnic background or class background as well. You would start to see some divergences perhaps in attitudes of Gen Z towards the particular values that they aspire to hold.
My last question, maybe Nadia, you can kick us off, is why are we talking about differences so much? I mean, weren't these differences always apparent, century after century after century? And can't we talk about things that bring us closer together?
It's a good question. I think every generation probably thinks they're different or there are differences. So I don't think this is a particular phenomena for the Gen Z. But every generation believes that their plight or their issues are the most important, because it is for them. So that's probably why we're discussing it, because Gen Z are the newest generation entering the workforce. They are going to be the future, so we do need to think about the way we are working to accommodate some of their needs. And there will be some similarities that we have, or things that bring us together, and I think it's important for us to keep having conversations so that we can explore those similarities and leverage them, rather than focusing on our differences so much. But there are real differences that we also do need to address and think about.
Eunice, do you think we have an undue focus on our differences, or do you think there are very real differences that need to be discussed and explored?
I think there are real differences. However, by discussing them, by asking about them, you can delve into them, and these differences can be worked upon, and figure out new ways of going about these differences and fostering a better environment for everybody.
Katerina, what do you think?
Completely agree, and as I mentioned when I was speaking earlier on, I think the differences are very real, but what unites us is greater than what divides us. We just need to be more empathetic, put ourselves into other people's shoes, and just that will help us relate to one another more. And I actually think that it's interesting to think of it from like a familial ties perspective. We're all able to engage, we find ways to engage in a non-judgmental, non-confrontational way with grandparents, people younger than us, aunts and uncles, etc. They're all from different generations and have lived different lives, and I think we are able to do the same at work. It's just when we're with family, we're thinking about these things perhaps a little bit more proactively.
Melissa, was it ever thus?
It was ever thus, and we can think about our own relationships with our parents, for example, and all the arguments that I would have had with my parents about the length of my skirt, or what I was going to do with my future and all the rest of it. But what each generation faces, as we mentioned in the report, is a different set of social, economic and political contexts, and it's really important that we understand that context, because that is also what's driving the differences. And if we want to understand why a particular generational cohort is behaving in a particular way or asking for particular things, understanding that sense of, for example, precarity, or the wider issues that are feeding into that, I think are really important. And again, it's all about making sure that the workplace is as effective as it can be, leveraging those differences going forward to try and have the most effective workplace, leveraging the innovation that Gen Z brings, as well as for example, the kind of experience that someone in a senior management position has got in terms of maybe managing people, the experience of years of working with people. And that's where things like reverse mentoring become really important, Nadia, that you were talking about as well.
I love the ideas of shadow boards that's mentioned in the document as well. I've really learned a lot this evening, so thank you very much. I'd just like to thank you all for your participation today. Do please collect one of these reports. It really is a good read, a quick read as well. So it's very good, very insightful. And let's say and has some concrete conclusions around how we can make things better. Shadow boards, that reverse mentoring piece. I think it's all very important for those of us who are working in these intergenerational office places. So I think that.